I remember the exact second it broke. Even though nothing outward happened, no raised voices, no slammed doors, just a sentence delivered with a smile that lingered half a second too long. 675,000 for contracts? That's cute. Some of us make real money. The conference room didn't react, but my body did. Something inside my chest went hollow, like air leaving a sealed room. I kept my face neutral, eyes steady, pen resting on the margin of my notebook. I'd learned long ago that stillness makes people uncomfortable. Inside, though, the sentence replayed itself again and again, each time sharper, each time more precise, like it was etching something permanent into me. What I saw was Bradley Moore leaning back in his chair, perfectly relaxed, already certain the room belonged to him. What I felt was not anger. It was colder than that. It was the sensation you get when you realize a bridge behind you has quietly burned while you were still standing on it. What I didn't say was everything. I didn't remind him that nearly every international deal he touched passed through my hands first. I didn't mention that compliance failures don't explode immediately. They rot, slowly, invisibly. I pretended not to notice the glances from two senior partners who suddenly found their notes fascinating. I pretended this was just another executive ego flexing. On the outside, I nodded once, like the comet hadn't landed. On the inside, something fundamental shifted. Not emotionally, structurally. I had spent 11 years building a reputation on being invisible and indispensable. I wasn't the voice people quoted. I was the line they never read until it was too late. Contracts were my language. Risk was my intuition. And in that moment, I understood that none of that mattered anymore. Bradley wasn't just mocking my salary, he was signaling something else entirely. He was telling the room that caution was weakness, that restraint was obsolete, and that people like me were accessories from an older version of the company. The disturbing part, the part that only hit me days later, was realizing that the comment hadn't been spontaneous. It was timed. That meeting agenda hadn't needed compensation to be discussed publicly. Bradley had added it himself. I checked the calendar history. His assistant had revised the agenda 40 minutes before the meeting. That detail sat with me in silence, growing heavier. This wasn't arrogance, it was positioning. When the Harrington and Wells contract landed on my desk weeks later, I already felt like a ghost walking through my own office. People spoke to me, but differently. Shorter sentences, fewer follow-ups. I was still senior contracts director in title, but something less visible had been taken from me. Authority without announcement. Identity without ceremony. The future I thought I was quietly earning evaporated without a single formal conversation. As I reviewed the contract, my mind was unusually calm, clause by clause, page by page. When I reached Schedule D, Clause 14.3, my stomach tightened. Termination rights structured asymmetrically. Penalties drafted in language that looked standard until you mapped the scenarios. Early exit under specific market shifts would devastate us. Not hypothetically, precisely. I wrote the warning carefully, stripped of emotion, anchored in precedent. I sent it through official channels, archived automatically, time-stamped beyond dispute. Bradley's response, if it could be called that, came later during a call where he laughed softly and told me not to overthink it. This deal is bigger than your checklist. The words themselves weren't the worst part. It was the confidence, the certainty that there would be no consequences. That call was recorded. I knew that. He knew it too, or at least he should have. By then, the numbness had set in. I stopped imagining outcomes. I stopped caring how I was perceived. That was the real loss. Not the role, not the money. The internal sense that effort still translated into safety. I went home each night and sat in silence, replaying meetings, emails, expressions. Not to relive them emotionally, but to catalog them. Patterns emerge when you stop reacting. What would you do if the humiliation didn't end when you walked away? Because mine didn't. It followed me into every interaction, every ignored email, every decision made without me that used to require my approval. I realized something else during those weeks, something that settled deep and refused to move. Bradley wasn't reckless. He was intentional. He didn't underestimate risk. He underestimated consequence. And he didn't sideline me by accident. By the time the contract moved forward untouched, I understood the truth with unsettling clarity. This wasn't a mistake waiting to happen. It was a plan already in motion, and I had just been written into it, whether I agreed or not. After the contract was signed, something curious happened. Everyone relaxed. The tension that had filled the executive floor for months evaporated overnight. People laughed louder in meetings. Calendars suddenly opened up. Bradley started taking longer lunches, sometimes leaving early, sometimes not showing up at all and letting others cover for him. From the outside, it looked like confidence. From where I stood, it looked like exposure. I said nothing. That was my first real shift in power. Silence chosen, not forced. I stayed in my role, same office, same title, same measured tone in emails. I congratulated teams when required. I nodded when Bradley spoke. I even smiled once or twice. The more invisible I became, the more comfortable they grew. That was the point. People only protect themselves when they feel watched. When they feel safe, they get sloppy. I started observing instead of participating. Bradley had a habit I hadn't noticed before. He talked too much when he felt admired. In meetings, he'd casually mention side decisions that hadn't gone through formal approval, minor deviations, nothing that triggered alarms on its own. But patterns don't need drama, they just need time. The first small opportunity came quietly. An internal review request crossed my desk late one evening. Routine, almost forgettable. It involved operational risk assessments tied to overseas vendors. Normally, I would have flagged it for the operations team. This time, I didn't rush. I read every attachment, cross-checked every assumption, and then I noticed it, a discrepancy between what Bradley had verbally approved and what had been documented. It wasn't illegal, not yet, but it was indefensible. I forwarded the file with a neutral note to internal audit. No accusations, no commentary, just a question. A single sentence asking for clarification on process alignment. That was it. I closed my laptop and went home. 2 weeks later, Bradley lost control of a small regional initiative. Officially, it was described as temporary oversight realignment. Unofficially, it was a bruise, the kind that doesn't show unless you know where to look. I watched his reaction from across the room when the announcement was made. His smile stayed in place, but his eyes flicked toward me for half a second longer than necessary. He was starting to feel something. Not fear, confusion. That was enough for now. The hidden weakness revealed itself slowly after that. Bradley didn't read deeply. He skimmed. He relied on summaries, bullet points, verbal assurances. He trusted momentum more than structure. To him, paperwork was a formality. To me, it was anatomy. I could tell which parts were fragile just by the way the language bent. And there was another thing. He assumed I was finished, that the humiliation had broken me, that people like me either explode or disappear. He understood neither patience nor restraint. That misunderstanding became my leverage. I continued to document everything, not obsessively, methodically. I didn't change my behavior enough to raise suspicion. I didn't withhold information. I didn't sabotage timelines. I simply let processes run exactly as written, without cushioning anyone from their own shortcuts. The satisfaction didn't come from watching him stumble. It came from watching him not notice. Late one evening, I overheard two managers talking near the elevators. They didn't know I was still in the building. One of them laughed and said, "Looks like contracts finally backed off. Guess he knows when he's beaten." I didn't correct them. I pressed the elevator button and went down alone. That night, I realized something important. The mini revenge wasn't about damage, it was about direction. I wasn't trying to hurt Bradley yet. I was adjusting the environment around him, tightening the margins, removing buffers he didn't even know existed. Revenge, I was learning, doesn't need movement, it needs gravity. I also noticed a shift in how people spoke to me again, subtle. Questions came back, opinions were quietly requested, not publicly, privately. The system was reorienting itself slowly, instinctively, toward stability, toward me. Bradley didn't see that either. He was too busy enjoying the afterglow of a deal he believed it secured his future. There was a moment, small, almost forgettable, when he passed my office and said casually, Looks like things are settling down, huh? I looked up from my screen and agreed. Inside, I was already several steps ahead. Because while he was celebrating the end of scrutiny, I was mapping the beginning of consequence. I had seen where the structure was weakest, I had confirmed what he didn't know I knew, and most importantly, I understood that his confidence was no longer armor, it was exposure. They thought it was over. I knew it had just started. The ripple effects didn't announce themselves. They never do. They arrived as hesitations, delays that didn't have names yet, questions that were framed too carefully. Bradley didn't know where they were coming from, only that things no longer moved the way they used to. Momentum, his favorite illusion, started to thin. I stayed harmless. That was the role I perfected. I spoke when asked. I answered precisely. I never volunteered opinions unless someone insisted. When Bradley talked, I nodded. When he joked, I smiled at the appropriate beat. The trick wasn't pretending to be small. It was allowing others to believe they had already measured you. The first sign of pressure showed up in his schedule. Meetings multiplied. Short calls turned into long ones. He started bringing his phone into rooms where he never had before, placing it face down on the table like it might betray him if he wasn't watching. Once, in the middle of a presentation, he lost his place and snapped at a junior manager for shuffling papers. The room went quiet. I wrote nothing. I just watched. The mini realignment I'd triggered pulled on threads he hadn't known existed. Internal audit doesn't accuse, it circulates. A question here, a follow-up there, each inquiry perfectly reasonable on its own. Together, they created a shape. Bradley sensed the shape before he understood it. That's when paranoia begins, not when danger is visible, but when it's implied. I noticed the change in how he spoke to me. He became overly polite, then abruptly distant, then polite again. He asked for summaries more often, but read them less. He began requesting verbal confirmations for things that used to be documented. That was the tell. People who trust paper don't fear it. People who fear paper start avoiding it. Revenge was changing me, too. I could feel it in the way my thoughts moved. Slower, narrower, more deliberate. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even satisfied. I was focused. That frightened me more than any emotion would have. Identity doesn't usually change with noise. It changes with repetition. A new threat emerged around that time, one I hadn't planned but immediately recognized. Harrington and Wells announced an internal review of vendor alignment outcomes. The language was neutral, the implication wasn't. Reviews lead to findings, findings lead to timelines, timelines create pressure, and pressure forces mistakes. The deadline for their preliminary assessment was 6 weeks out. Bradley felt it immediately. He started pushing again, not openly, but sideways, asking people to clean up narratives, suggesting that certain communications might be misinterpreted out of context. He called me one afternoon and asked casually if I still had copies of my early memos about the contract. I told him the truth. Everything was archived. There was a pause on the line. Too long. That night, I stayed late and accessed a system I hadn't touched in years, not because I wasn't allowed to, but because no one ever thought to look there anymore. Legacy compliance storage, old risk repositories, forgotten because they belonged to a time when caution still mattered. I had maintained them out of habit. No one had told me to stop. What I found wasn't a single document, it was a map. Emails that referenced drafts that were never finalized, call logs tied to calendar revisions, internal notes that captured verbal directives before they were softened for records. None of it explosive alone. Together, they formed a narrative that contradicted the one Bradley had been selling, about decisiveness, about alignment, about control. I didn't extract anything. I didn't forward files. I didn't leave digital footprints. I simply confirmed access. That was enough. Knowing where the ground gives way changes how you walk. How long could you pretend to be harmless if everything depended on it?
The pressure began to show physically in him. Darker circles under the eyes, a constant tightness in his jaw. He started sitting closer to the door in meetings as if escape had become a consideration. Once, he tried to corner me after a briefing, lowering his voice, asking whether he thought people were reading too much into procedural stuff. I met his eyes and said I thought processes existed for a reason. He laughed too quickly. The deadline approached. Harrington and Wells requested additional documentation. The board scheduled a closed session to discuss risk exposure posture. Bradley wasn't invited to that one. He found out after. The way his name was absent said more than any accusation could have. I reflected briefly on who I was becoming. This wasn't triumph, it was attrition. Piece by piece, certainty was leaving him, and with it, the version of himself that had walked into that conference room and smiled while humiliating someone he thought was finished. By the end of the week, I knew something he didn't. I had access to material that wouldn't just explain what went wrong, it would show who knew, when they knew it, and who decided to move forward anyway. It wasn't revenge yet, but it was catastrophic potential. And once you know where that kind of power sits, pretending not to see it becomes impossible.
The shift became visible the morning the tone of the building changed. It wasn't loud. It never is when real consequences begin. Conversations lowered as I passed. Doors closed more carefully. People started arriving earlier, leaving later, as if proximity to effort might offer protection. Bradley noticed it too. I could tell by the way he walked faster, by how often he checked his phone, by how his confidence now required witnesses. Publicly, nothing had happened yet. Officially, everything was under review. But reputations don't wait for conclusions. They respond to signals, and the signals were everywhere. The first visible crack appeared during a regional leadership call. Bradley was presenting revised operational forecasts when a board liaison interrupted him, not aggressively, just precisely. She asked where certain assumptions originated. He gave an answer that used to work. This time, it didn't. She followed up with a second question, then a third, each one narrower, each one quieter. Bradley's voice tightened. He glanced down at his notes more than usual. I stayed silent. When the call ended, no one applauded, no one joked. People logged off quickly, like they didn't want their names attached to the moment. An hour later, a request went out for supporting documentation, not from operations, from risk and compliance, from my division. That was when Bradley came to see me. He didn't storm in. He knocked. That alone told me how much had changed. He closed the door behind him and stood instead of sitting, hands loosely clasped, posture controlled but strained. He said my name the way people do when they're trying to remember if they still have leverage. "I'm getting the sense," he began, "that things are drifting." I waited. He continued, choosing words carefully now. He mentioned optics, alignment, the importance of unity during sensitive periods. Then finally, the threats surfaced, not overt but implied. Careers, he reminded me, were long, reputations fragile. People who were seen as obstacles didn't always land softly. I looked at him and felt nothing. I told him the truth calmly, that my responsibility was process integrity, that reviews followed predefined protocols, that documentation spoke for itself. I didn't accuse him. I didn't reassure him either. I let the silence do what it does best. He left without shaking my hand. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that the plan he was now reacting to hadn't begun after the humiliation. It had begun years earlier. The systems I maintained, the archives I preserved, the habits of documenting verbal directives that others dismissed as paranoia. I hadn't done it for revenge. I'd done it because I believed institutions fail when memory disappears. Now that memory was surfacing. Harrington and Wells escalated their review. Media inquiries followed, not accusations, just questions. Analysts began asking why termination exposure hadn't been mitigated. The board convened again. This time, they requested a timeline. Not a narrative, a sequence. I provided it. Dates, emails, calls, decisions. Not framed emotionally, not framed defensively, just ordered facts. The kind that don't argue, the kind that wait. Bradley tried to intervene once more, indirectly. A mutual contact suggested I soften language, emphasize collective responsibility. I declined. Softening had already happened, years ago. This was clarity. By then, the damage was no longer preventable. Every attempt to control the story introduced another inconsistency. Every effort to deflect attention created a new record. Bradley's strength, decisiveness, had become his liability. He moved too fast for a situation that now required stillness. I watched him unravel professionally without ever raising my voice. Meetings he used to lead were reassigned. Invitations stopped arriving. His name began appearing in footnotes instead of headlines. He noticed. Of course he did. Once, passing in the corridor, he stopped abruptly and asked, "Is this about that meeting?" I told him no. It was about everything after. The inevitability settled in quietly. There was no final confrontation, no dramatic exposure, just a sequence of events that could no longer be interrupted. Processes triggered other processes. Oversight invited scrutiny. Scrutiny demanded accountability. The machine did what machines do when they're finally fed accurate input. By the time the board requested a formal responsibility assessment, the outcome was already decided, not emotionally, structurally. I walked back to my office that evening and sat alone, listening to the building settle. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to acknowledge the cost. Not satisfaction, not relief, just recognition. Something irreversible had crossed a threshold. The collapse hadn't happened yet, but the damage already had. By the time the pressure peaked, I was no longer sure who I would be when it was over. That realization came quietly, late one night, as I sat alone in my office with the lights off. The city reflected faintly in the glass. Everything was in motion now. Too much of it. Reviews feeding investigations, investigations feeding legal briefings feeding board anxiety. The system had momentum. And momentum doesn't ask permission. It only asks whether you're ready to be crushed along with everyone else. For the first time since this began, I felt exposed. Not to Bradley, but to the consequences of my own precision. A single misstep now wouldn't just slow the plan, it would redirect it toward me, toward my motives, toward questions I couldn't afford to answer emotionally. I had built everything on restraint, on neutrality, on process. If that cracked, even slightly, the narrative could flip. Whistleblower becomes conspirator. Archivist becomes architect. I understood then why most people walk away before the end. The board's legal counsel requested an expanded submission, contextual this time. They wanted not just what happened, but why decisions were made the way they were. Intent. Judgment, interpretation. Those are dangerous words. They invite opinion, and opinion leaves fingerprints. For 2 days I didn't respond. Bradley noticed. He tried once more, this time without intermediaries. A message appeared on my phone late in the evening. Short, direct, almost pleading. He wrote that things had gone too far, that people were misunderstanding timelines, that we could still reframe this together. He reminded me, subtly, that survival often depends on knowing when to stop pushing. I stared at the message for a long time. This was the moment everything balanced on. Not professionally, but internally. I could step back, let ambiguity absorb the blame, let the system correct itself imperfectly. I would be safe, comfortable, still respected. Or I could finish what I hadn't started, but could no longer stop. For the first time, my composure cracked. Not outwardly, but inside, I felt something dangerously close to grief. For the person I had been before silence became strategy, before patience became a weapon. Revenge hadn't given me satisfaction, it had given me clarity. And clarity is isolating. I almost walked away. What stopped me wasn't anger. It was memory. The meeting, the smirk, the deliberate agenda change, the certainty that I would absorb the risk while someone else absorbed the credit. Walking away now wouldn't restore who I used to be. It would only confirm that he had been right to dismiss me. So I answered the board, not with opinion, with structure. I framed intent through sequence, decisions through documentation density. I showed how warnings escalate when ignored, how risk tolerance mutates under pressure, how authority expresses itself not through orders, but through what it allows to proceed. I didn't name Bradley as the villain. I didn't need to. The shape of responsibility emerged on its own. That submission triggered the final review. At the same time, something nearly derailed everything. An external advisor flagged my name during a side discussion, questioning whether my proximity to the issue compromised objectivity. It was reasonable, dangerous. I was asked to clarify my role in person. That meeting was the closest I came to losing control. Sitting there, answering calmly, I felt the weight of months pressing against my ribs. One wrong inflection, one defensive note, and the entire architecture would collapse inward. I focused on facts, on dates, on language. I became what I had always been, boring, precise, unassailable. It worked. The concern was noted, then dismissed. When I left the room, my hands were shaking. I didn't stop them. I let myself feel the cost, just for a moment. This wasn't victory. It was endurance, and endurance leaves marks. Later that week, Bradley finally understood. Not officially, not through an announcement, but through absence. Meetings canceled without explanation, calls not returned, decisions made without him. He sent one last message, this one longer, angrier, accusatory. He demanded to know why I was doing this to him. I didn't reply, because by then, he already knew. And as the machinery moved towards its conclusion, I faced the final unsettling truth. This hadn't just been about reclaiming dignity or control. It had reshaped me into someone I barely recognized, someone capable of waiting, watching, and finishing. So I ask you this. If winning meant becoming someone you no longer recognize, would you still finish? Bradley did. And in that moment when his certainty finally collapsed into understanding, he realized exactly who had been destroying him all along.
The end didn't arrive with an announcement. It arrived with silence. One morning, Bradley's name was simply gone from the internal calendar. No explanation, no farewell email. His assistant's desk was empty by noon. By the end of the day, his access credentials stopped resolving. In a company that thrived on language, the absence of words said everything. The board called it strategic restructuring. That phrase would be repeated carefully, consistently, until it hardened into official truth. No one challenged it. No one needed to. The responsibility assessment had already done its work. Careers don't collapse all at once. They hollow out, decision by decision, until there's nothing left to defend. I wasn't in the room when the final determination was made. That was deliberate. My role had ended the moment the facts stood on their own. I learned the outcome the same way everyone else did, through an understated update circulated late in the afternoon. Bradley Moore was relieved of his duties, effective immediately. No mention of failure, no mention of loss, just absence. I closed the message and returned to my work. That was the strangest part. There was no surge of triumph, no satisfaction, just a steady, unfamiliar calm. The kind that follows a long illness when you realize the pain is gone, but the body has been permanently changed. In the days that followed, people began speaking to me differently, not loudly, not publicly, but with a new precision. Meetings paused until I arrived. Questions were phrased more carefully. My inbox filled again, not with demands, but with requests. I was asked to step into an interim advisory role, then another, then one more. Eventually, the board made it formal. Global Head of Risk and Compliance. The title looked heavier than it felt. What I had lost couldn't be restored by promotion. I had lost a version of myself, the one who believed loyalty would be recognized without proof, that restraint alone could protect you, that dignity didn't need documentation. That person didn't survive this. But I had reclaimed something else. Control. Not dominance, not power in the theatrical sense. Control over my narrative, over my boundaries, over the quiet mechanisms that actually decide outcomes. I no longer needed to be seen to matter. I had proof of where influence truly lived. As for Bradley, his collapse continued off stage. Consulting offers disappeared. Invitations dried up. His name, once associated with confidence and momentum, became a cautionary reference. Never spoken directly, but understood. People don't like to examine how certainty fails. They just learn to avoid it. I never contacted him. I never corrected the story others told themselves. Revenge didn't require explanation. Explanation would have cheapened it. What stayed with me most was the realization of how little noise it took to dismantle something that seemed immovable. No confrontation, no threats, just patience, memory, and the refusal to absorb someone else's recklessness. I often think back to that first meeting, the smile, the sentence meant to shrink me. At the time, it felt like humiliation. Now I recognize it for what it was, a miscalculation. He assumed power announced itself. He assumed silence was surrender. He assumed I would either break or disappear. Instead, I documented. That is the part people misunderstand about revenge like this. It isn't fueled by rage. Rage burns too fast. This kind of revenge is built on acceptance, accepting the loss, the numbness, the internal collapse, accepting that something is already gone and that survival is no longer the goal. Truth is, I didn't win back my old identity. I let it go. What replaced it was quieter, sharper, and far more durable. I learned that the most devastating consequences aren't delivered by those who shout, but by those who wait, by those who remember, by those who never interrupt someone while they're destroying themselves. When people ask how I stayed so calm through it all, I never answer directly, because the calm didn't come from confidence. It came from the moment I stopped trying to survive. The loudest revenge I ever took was saying nothing.